Hello everyone and welcome back to RubberStamps.com. Today we're going to be starting a brand new series that we are calling Practice Prompts, because this series is going to give us an opportunity to practice some of the skills that are necessary for card making and bullet journaling and just using stamps and inks in general. So before we get started, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel if you want to see more content like this. So one of the first things that I want to talk about in this practice prompt is your ink blocks. So there are several different kinds of ink blocks that you can purchase. These are the kind that we are going to be using today. We have 3 different sizes here. All 3 of these work really well for different sizes of stamps. Now what I like about these specific acrylic blocks is that they're nice and thick, so you can see how thick that is right there. So they're very sturdy. They don't bend, they don't, there's no give there. They're very sturdy. And I also really like that we have this grid here so that when you're stamping, you can line up your stamps with that grid. And then since they're clear, you can see through and really easily line these up on your card or your bullet journal or whatever it is that you're making. So this is what we're going to be using today, and the kind of acrylic blocks that honestly I prefer. But I know there are also several different kinds of blocks that you can use. The next thing that I want to talk about is types of ink. So what we're going to be using today is archival ink. We use these for most of the cards that we create. I really like this kind of ink because it's permanent, so it dries very quickly, it doesn't smear once it's dry, and it's waterproof. So this is what we're going to be using today and what we use for most of our cards, but there are also several different kinds of inks like pigment inks and dye inks that also have their purpose for other things as well. So to start, we are going to be using this stamp set today. This is a collaboration that we did with Farada Sharma. Obviously the first thing you do is open up the stamps. On our stamp sets you have 2 different sides of acetate. Both sides are pretty sturdy, so you don't want to throw this away because it's really helpful to stick these back on here, put them back in the packaging for easy storage. But we're just going to set that aside. And to start today, I think I'm going to use this stamp right here because it's a medium size, so it's going to be easy to see, and it also is a fairly solid impression. You can see this is pretty solid compared to some of these thinner lines, which we will get to later, but I just thought we could start with this really solid impression so that you can pretty easily see the ink on these stamps. So since this is a pretty small stamp, we can use our smallest acrylic block. I'm just going to line it up in the center, and then just make sure to tap it down, make sure it's on there really well. You can see that it's pretty sticky on the back. So once it's on the block, it's not coming off. It's not going to move, it's not going to smear or anything like that. It's on there pretty good because it's very sticky on the back. So now that we have our stamp adhered to the block, we're going to take our ink, remove the cap, and what I like to do is take the ink to the stamp. So you just flip it over and tap onto the stamp. Now you want to make sure to do this multiple times because you can kind of see this is a felt surface, so there is some texture there, and you can see that if you don't tap the ink enough times, some of that texture comes through onto the stamp, which if you're going for that look, that could be something that's pretty cool. I'll show you what that looks like. So you can see that it's a fairly light impression, but there is some texture there, so if you wanted a more distressed look, you could only tap the ink a couple times to get that texture, but we'll keep tapping the ink onto the stamp and I'll show you what a nice thick impression is going to look like. So now that I've tapped several more times onto the ink onto the stamp, you can see how much darker that is. So we're going to take that and compare, and you can see how much of a difference that makes just tapping a few more times onto the stamp. So again, this could be cool if you're looking for a textured look, but what we're looking for right here is just a very crisp and clear dark impression. Something else that I want to mention is make sure that you're just tapping. If you slide across the stamp, that again is going to add some texture to the impression, which could be a cool look if that's what you're going for, but it just does not show up as clearly as if you are really making sure the stamp is saturated with the ink. And the next thing I want to mention is when you stamp onto the paper, don't move the stamp. Make sure you just push straight down, add some even pressure across the stamp, but don't rock the stamp and don't slide it around, just straight down onto the paper and remove. Alright, and next I want to go over a few tips for stamping with larger stamps. So we're going to be using this butterfly. As you can see, it does fit on our medium-sized block, but I want to show you a few tips for using this extra large block that we have. So even though we don't need all of this space, we're going to use this block today just for this demonstration. So the first thing I want to mention is that because you have all of this space, you don't necessarily need to take your stamp and put it right in the center of the block. You can, if the stamp is a little bit bigger or if you just want it to be centered, you can put the stamp right in the center. But a tip that I like to do, especially if I'm doing bullet journaling or if I need just a little bit more control with my stamp, is I actually like to take the stamp and put it more towards the corner of the block. That way, if I have a bullet journal and I need to get into the center of the page a little bit more, you can see that because it's right on the edge right here, I can get in there a lot easier than if it was completely centered in the block. And the same can go for cards. If you wanted to stamp on here, it gives it a little bit more room to work with and line it up pretty easily. Alright, and that's looking pretty good. So then my next tip is to line up your stamp, place it in its spot, and use very even pressure. So one way you can accomplish this is by making sure this hand is flat and using this one as some leverage. That way you can really get some even pressure. Another option is to move your hands around the stamp, adding pressure across the entire face of the acrylic block. And next I want to talk about a really fun technique, which would be shading and distressing using one stamp and one color. So what I mean by this is that we're going to take this stamp and then our emerald green ink, and we're going to ink up this stamp like we've been doing for the last few things. So make sure that your stamp is nice and saturated. And then you'll take your stamp, push down with even firm pressure, remove, and then don't ink another time before just using it again. So you can see that now we have two different shades of green, only using one time of inking. And you can keep doing this as many times as you want to get different shades. You can see that's pretty light now, but you can do it as many times as you want to get some really cool variations of shade and almost like a distressed look. But I like using this to get, different dimensions and shades of the same color. Alright, so you can see that I just kind of continued doing that with the foliage, and then I also did the same thing with this butterfly stamp using purple ink. So you can kind of see how it fades the more times that you stamp it, but I think that can be a really fun technique. All right, and the next technique that we are going to talk about is creating two-tones and gradients on our stamps using ink pads. So to start, we are going to do a two-tone stamp. So we're going to take our green, and because these are clear, it's really easy to see what you're doing. So actually what you kind of want to do for this one is, instead of bringing the ink to the stamp, we're going to bring the stamp to the ink so that we can see exactly where we're lining it up. And what we're going to try to do is just put the ink on the stem and the leaves, and leave the flower part clean because we're going to be using a different color for that. So take the corner of the ink pad and just line it up. We're going to have to move it around a few times to get all of the leaves. But again, we're tapping, making sure that we're saturating this part of the stamp. All right, and that looks pretty good. So we're going to set aside the green and get our pink and do the same thing, but flip it over so that we're only getting the flower pink. All right, that looks really good. So now we'll take our paper and stamp. And that looks perfect. So it's a really easy way to get some different tones on your stamp just using inks. All right, and the final technique that we're going to be doing today is creating a gradient using multiple different types of inks. So we're going to be using blue and pink for this, and this butterfly stamp that we clearly have used many times before. So for the first step, you're going to take the lighter of the two colors. I think these are both pretty close when it comes to which one's lighter, but I think I'm going to start with the blue. And the reason you want to start with the lighter color is because you don't want to transfer any ink from the other color to this ink pad on accident. So what we're going to do is start from the bottom and just tap onto the ink pad like we've been doing, and go about halfway up the butterfly. Make sure you get this part really saturated. You can even go a little bit more than halfway if you want to, but just make sure that you're stopping before you reach the top. Then you're going to grab your second color, flip the stamp over, and do the same thing on this side. Going to about the halfway point, but you do want to make sure that these colors overlap, and I'll show you why in a second. And another thing that you can do is, if you really want to, you can come back in with this color. Make sure you're getting it saturated. And tap a little bit lighter when you get towards the top. Push harder towards the bottom, lighter towards the top. Then take your stamp and apply even pressure. And here you can see that we've created a gradient. So we started down here with the blue and up here with the pink, and where they meet in the middle, we're actually having some purple come through. And one critique I would say of my job this time is that you can see a little bit of a line right there, so I think I should have tapped a little bit lighter in this middle section so that it was more of a natural gradient, like over on this side. The only place I'm seeing that really is right here in the blue. But a way to avoid that is to tap harder down here and lighter up here. All right, and if you wanted to put all of these skills together, you could create a card like this. You can see that we stamped, we did a gradient, and we also did some dimension with stamping multiple times. So this is just a little example of something you could make using all of these skills. But again, today we went over how to stamp, how to create some dimension, how to do two-toned, and how to create a gradient. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you can see more content like this one and so that you can stay up to date on all of the practice prompts that we're coming out with. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.